Derren stood before the swirling portal, his usual smirk wavering as the reality of what lay ahead hit him. The shimmering light of the gateway rippled with magic, casting an eerie glow over the stone courtyard. He swallowed, gripping the handle of his shotgun a little tighter. So what? We step into this magic vortex and suddenly it's all dragons and wizards? I've seen Stargate. This is how you end up fighting space bugs. His voice carried a sharp edge of sarcasm, the kind he relied on when things felt too surreal. Gunnar, unfazed, glanced at him, his one good eye unreadable beneath the hard lines of his face. "Not quite," he said simply, and then, without another word, stepped into the portal, disappearing into the shifting light with Alpha, his dire wolf companion, padding silently at his side. Derren exhaled, shaking his head. "Yeah, no big deal. Just interdimensional travel. What could go wrong?" He stepped forward, the world blurring and bending around him. For a moment, it felt like the universe stretched him thin, pulled him apart, and then slammed him back together. He stumbled, nearly tripping over his feet as the realm beyond the portal came into sharp focus. The sky above was a muted, eternal twilight, hues of purple and deep orange swirling like an endless sunset. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the smell of wet earth and something darker, older. The ground beneath them was cracked, blackened, as if scorched by fire and magic, but patches of green, vibrant and defiant, sprouted through the ash. Derren took in the landscape, twisted blackened trees, jagged mountains in the distance, and the shadow of a looming castle far off, its crumbling spires cutting jagged lines against the twilight sky. It was the aftermath of a war, a land trying to heal from the wounds of something catastrophic. "Okay," Derren muttered, his voice low. "This place looks like Mordor after a natural disaster. How is this even real?" Gunnar's steps were steady, purposeful, his expression unchanged. It wasn't always like this. This was once a thriving realm. Derren shot him a sideways glance. "Let me guess. Daddy Demon King wrecked the place before you gave him the old one too?" Gunnar stopped walking, his mechanical arm gleaming in the low light as he turned to face Derren. His face was hard, unreadable. "This is where I lost it." He flexed his cybernetic fingers, the faint hum of the enchanted silver dagger housed within barely audible. Ultranacious wasn't just another demon. He was something else. Older than the dark magic most of us deal with. His power ran through this entire realm. Derren's sarcasm faltered as Gunnar spoke. There was something in his voice, something Derren hadn't heard before. It wasn't just the story of a mission gone wrong. It was something deeper, more personal. "He and I weren't the only ones in that fight," Gunnar continued. "Lissandra was there too. She came to face her father, to end his reign of darkness. But Ultranacious didn't give her the chance. He hit her with a spell. Dark magic, something ancient. She couldn't move, couldn't fight. It was just me and him." Derren's eyes flicked toward the distant castle, the weight of Gunnar's words settling over him. "So, it was just you and the big bad. No backup?" Gunnar nodded. "Lissandra was out cold. I had to finish it. Every move I made, every strike, it was about keeping him off balance long enough for me to get in one shot. One clean strike with the silver dagger. I barely made it out alive." Derren swallowed, suddenly aware of the quiet around them, as if even the wind had stopped to listen. "I lost my arm, my eye, most of the team, but I killed him. That was the deal." Gunnar flexed his mechanical fingers again, the faint glow of runes along the arm barely visible. "The price? It wasn't just my body. It was everything I had to lose that day." The distant castle loomed larger as they walked. The scarred land was a reminder of the Demon King's rule, and Derren could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He wasn't used to this kind of battle, this kind of story. For a moment, his usual humor deserted him. "And now?" Derren asked quietly. "Now Lissandra fights to heal this place," Gunnar said. "But some scars run too deep. Even with Ultranacious gone, his darkness left a mark." They walked in silence for a few moments, the the wind whispering through the blackened trees. Derren glanced at Gunnar, his mind racing. So, let me get this straight. You saved the realm, killed the Demon King, and somehow didn't die in the process? No wonder she called you. Gunnar's face remained impassive. It wasn't about me. It was about stopping him, and making sure Lissandra survived. Derren shook his head, his usual sarcasm creeping back. Well, at least now I know why this place feels like a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. They continued their trek toward the castle, its broken towers rising like jagged teeth against the twilight. As they approached, the air grew thicker, heavier. Derren could feel the weight of the realm's history pressing down on him, the sense of a place that had seen too much death, too much darkness. Guess we'll see if this place can recover after all, Derren muttered as they neared the gates. Gunnar didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the castle, on the memories of what had been lost here, and what was still at stake.
As the massive iron gates of the castle creaked open, Derren's breath hitched, his eyes widening as he took in the scene before him. The courtyard was alive with movement, griffins gliding down from the sky, their powerful wings flapping as they landed with surprising grace. Nearby, creatures of various forms, some humanoid, others far more beast-like, were working diligently to rebuild the once crumbling castle. The air buzzed with magic, the realm slowly stitching itself back together. Griffins. Of course there are griffins, Derren muttered under his breath, the last shred of skepticism slipping away. Why not? Gunnar walking beside him barely noticed. His gaze was fixed on the figure approaching from across the courtyard. Lissandra moved with a fluid grace, her long dark hair catching in the breeze, her emerald green eyes locked on Gunnar's face. She wore dark leather armor, but it was the familiar silver dagger at her waist that caught Gunnar's attention. As she neared, Alpha, Gunnar's dire wolf companion, tensed and stepped in front of him, a low growl rumbling from deep in his throat. The last time Alpha had seen Lissandra, she had been incapacitated, and Gunnar had been on the edge of death. His instincts took over, protecting his Alpha. Gunnar knelt down, his hand resting on Alpha's thick fur. "Easy, boy," he said softly, his voice steady and calm. "She's not the enemy." Alpha's growl subsided, though his sharp yellow eyes remained locked on Lissandra as she came closer. With a nod from Gunnar, the dire wolf stepped aside, allowing her to approach. Lissandra paused before Gunnar, her eyes briefly flicking to Derren before settling on the man who had saved her life. And her realm. She took in the sight of him, the missing eye, the cybernetic arm, and the scars etched into his skin. But beneath it all, he was still the same Gunnar, the warrior who had risked everything to free her from her father's shadow. "I didn't know if I'd see you again," she said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. Gunnar's gaze drifted to the silver dagger at her waist, the same one he had used to strike the killing blow against Ultranacious. His lips curved into a faint smile. "Looks good on you," he said, nodding toward the weapon. "You wear it well." Lissandra's hand rested on the hilt of the dagger, her fingers brushing over the runes engraved into the blade. "It's a reminder of what we fought for, of what was lost." Her eyes softened as she looked back at Gunnar, and of the man who gave everything to make sure this realm didn't fall into eternal darkness. Derren stood a few paces back, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. Between the griffins, the magical creatures working on the castle, and the emotionally charged reunion between Gunnar and Lissandra, it was a lot to process. "I swear, I'm in the middle of a high-budget fantasy movie," Derren muttered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. Lissandra turned, her eyes scanning the courtyard with a quiet pride. "Things are changing," she said, her voice filled with hope. "The darkness that once choked this realm is beginning to lift. The creatures you see here, they've returned to help rebuild. There's still a long way to go, but the land is healing." Gunnar walked beside her, his sharp eye taking in the improvements, the way life had begun to return to the scorched earth, the repaired walls of the castle, the creatures working together in harmony. It was a stark contrast to the devastation he had left behind after the battle with Ultranacious. "You've done well," Gunnar said, his voice gruff but sincere. "This place, it's not what it used to be. It's better." Lissandra's lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile. "I owe much of that to you, Gunnar. Without you, there would have been nothing left to save." Derren, still trailing behind, glanced between them, unsure whether to interrupt the moment. "So, I don't suppose you've got any advice for someone who's new to all of this?" he asked, waving a hand at the magical chaos around him. Lissandra's smile widened as she glanced at Derren. "Stick with Gunnar," she said simply. "He has a way of getting people through the impossible." Derren snorted. "Yeah, I'm starting to get that." As they continued their walk through the courtyard, the weight of the past seemed to fade, replaced by the promise of a future Lissandra had fought to secure, with Gunnar's help. And for the first time since they'd arrived, Derren began to feel something he hadn't expected in this strange, magical place. Hope. Lissandra led Gunnar, Alpha, and Derren through the castle halls, their footsteps echoing against the stone floor. The dark magic that had once gripped the realm had left its mark on these walls, but now, with her efforts, the castle was beginning to reflect hope rather than despair. They passed through corridors that had been recently cleared of rubble, the ancient stonework now visible beneath. "Impressive," Derren murmured, glancing at the rebuilt sections. "Feels a little more Game of Thrones, a little less Ruins of Mordor." Lissandra allowed herself a brief smile as they entered the great hall. The once shattered space had been meticulously cleaned and restored. A large hearth crackled warmly, filling the room with a faint, smoky scent. Along one side, a long table had been set up, and several decanters sat on it, filled with deep red wine and what appeared to be some kind of glowing, enchanted liquor. "Please help yourselves," Lissandra offered, gesturing toward the drinks. "You've had a long journey." Derren didn't hesitate. He moved to the table, pouring himself a glass of wine with a quick nod of approval. "Don't mind if I do." He took a sip and gave a low whistle. "Okay, not bad for otherworldly booze." Gunnar, however, was more reserved, offering Lissandra a polite nod before taking a seat at the large table in what appeared to be a meeting chamber adjacent to the hall. Alpha padded silently to Gunnar's side, keeping a wary eye on Lissandra, though the tension from earlier had eased. Lissandra's expression shifted as she sat down across from Gunnar and Derren. Her usual confidence seemed to waver, her eyes flicking around the room as though she expected something, or someone, to appear. It wasn't often she looked nervous, but there was a subtle unease to her now. "Something's bothering you," Gunnar said, cutting through the silence. Lissandra exhaled slowly, her fingers toying with the silver dagger at her waist. "I asked you here because I need your help, as a mediator." Derren, mid-sip, paused and raised an eyebrow. "Mediator? Between who?" Lissandra's eyes dropped to the table for a moment before meeting Gunnar's gaze. "My sisters. I fear they're plotting against me." The room fell silent for a beat. "Sisters?" Gunnar repeated, his tone low but attentive. Lissandra nodded. "When our father ruled, there was an unspoken understanding of who would inherit control over the realm. I believed that after Ultranacious was defeated, I would be able to lead and rebuild, but my sisters, Nezra and Velara, they don't see it that way." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They've been conspiring, trying to claim parts of the realm for themselves. I'm afraid their ambitions will tear everything apart before it even has a chance to heal. And if they do, the darkness my father left behind could return." Derren exchanged a glance with Gunnar, his sarcasm momentarily replaced with concern. "So, this is more than just a sibling rivalry." "Much more," Lissandra confirmed. "My father's magic is still present, dormant, but not gone. If they push too far, it could awaken again." Gunnar leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and calculating. You want me to mediate between them? And what? Get them to stand down? Lissandra sighed, her voice heavy with emotion. I trust you. You saved me and you saved this realm. You've faced worse. But I need someone strong enough to keep them in check, someone they'll respect. Gunnar's eyes narrowed. They'll listen to me? They will, Lissandra said, determination returning to her voice. They have to. Gunnar exchanged a look with Alpha, who seemed to understand the weight of the situation. Then he nodded, his gaze shifting back to Lissandra. All right, I'll mediate. But if they don't listen... Lissandra's lips curved into a faint smile. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The stone corridors of Nezra's fortress were cold, their smooth, dark walls reflecting none of the warmth that had begun to return to Lissandra's castle. As Gunnar and Derren stepped through the large iron doors, they were greeted by the sight of a dimly lit chamber, its towering ceilings covered in shadows. Nezra's domain felt untouched by the renewal sweeping the realm. It was a place still steeped in the past, haunted by the remnants of her father's reign. I can see why she doesn't throw many parties, Derren muttered under his breath, glancing at the sparse decorations and dark tapestries lining the walls. The atmosphere weighed heavily on him, and he could sense that this was going to be more than just a meeting. Gunnar's expression remained neutral as they approached the centre of the room. There, sitting atop an elevated throne carved from black stone, was Nezra. Her eyes were sharp and cold, taking them in with a silent assessment. Dressed in dark, flowing robes, she radiated an aura of command, an icy authority that reminded Derren of a predator lying in wait. So, Nezra said, her voice low and measured, the great Gunnar returns, the one who cut down my father. Her words were laced with bitterness, but her face betrayed little emotion. And what brings you to my halls today? Gunnar didn't flinch. Your sister asked for help. She wants peace. Nezra's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. Peace, she echoed, the word dripping with disdain. Lissandra always was a dreamer, wasn't she? Believing that this realm could simply... heal. Derren sensed the growing tension in the room. Nezra's resentment was palpable, and her gaze never left Gunnar, as though she were daring him to challenge her. Maybe, Derren cut in, his tone light but calculated, but I don't think Lissandra's the only one who wants this place to bounce back, right? I mean, you've got this whole fortress here. Would be a shame to see it crumble under the weight of old grudges. Nezra's eyes flicked toward Derren, narrowing slightly. And who are you to speak of this realm's future? A mortal from a world far beneath ours? Derren held up his hands, stepping forward casually. Just a guy with a knack for reading the room. And I'm getting the sense that what you really want is control. Not just for the sake of it, but to protect this place, keep it from falling apart again. Am I wrong? For a moment, silence hung between them. Nezra's gaze lingered on Derren, weighing his words. It was subtle, but Derren saw the shift. Her expression softened ever so slightly. I don't trust my sisters, Nezra said finally, her voice a cold whisper. Lissandra thinks she can lead us into the light, but she's naive. And Velara, she craves power more than anything. If it were up to them, this realm would be destroyed by their idealism and greed. Gunnar crossed his arms, his voice calm but firm. So what's your plan? Take control by force? Nezra stood descending the steps of her throne. Her robes trailed behind her like a shadow, her footsteps barely making a sound. I don't need force, Gunnar. I need someone who understands what's at stake. Someone who knows that the darkness isn't gone. It's simply biding its time. She stopped just in front of them, her eyes locking onto Gunnar's. My father's magic runs through this realm, through its very foundation. If Lissandra can't control it, someone else must. Derren glanced at Gunnar, sensing his stoic ally wasn't going to ease the tension. He decided to take another swing. Look, I get it. You're the logical one. You're playing the long game, trying to prevent a disaster down the line, but maybe that's why you need someone like Lissandra. Balance. You're all too smart to let this realm fall apart again, right? Nezra's eyes flickered, her stoic mask cracking just enough for Derren to see a glimmer of doubt. She remained silent, but the tension in the room shifted. Let me guess, Derren said, folding his arms and tilting his head. You've got backup plans, contingencies, but the best outcome is peace, right? You're playing the odds. Nezra regarded him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, but her expression softened. Just a little. I won't let this realm fall to chaos. Not again. Not for anyone. Gunnar stepped forward, his voice steady. Then work with your sisters. You don't have to trust them completely, but don't let this tear everything apart. We can find a way forward that keeps the realm intact. Nezra's gaze shifted between Gunnar and Derren before she gave a slight nod. I'll consider it. But don't think for a moment I'll bend to Lissandra's whims. Derren grinned. We wouldn't expect you to. But maybe give her a little credit. She's stronger than you think. Nezra's eyes flickered with something unreadable before she turned, moving back toward her throne. I'll speak with Velara, she said, her voice cool once more. But this isn't over. After their tense meeting with Nezra, Gunnar and Derren made their way toward Velara's stronghold. Unlike Nezra's cold, calculated fortress, Velara's domain was a stark contrast. It was a place of opulence and ambition, with towering spires and banners of rich crimson hanging from the walls. The land surrounding it was more alive than Nezra's, but there was an underlying tension, as though the realm itself was holding its breath. Okay, Derren muttered, eyeing the grandiosity of the place. This looks more like someone who wants to be queen. Gunnar grunted in agreement. The lush gardens and well-maintained walkways were a sign that Velara had no intention of hiding her ambitions. But there was something else, a feeling in the air that made Gunnar's skin crawl. The dark magic that had been so prevalent in their battle with Ultranacious seemed to pulse faintly here just beneath the surface. They were led through a grand entrance hall and into a large chamber. Unlike Nezra's dimly lit fortress, Velara's hall was brightly illuminated with glowing crystals that lined the walls, casting a golden hue over everything. At the far end of the room, Velara sat on a throne of polished silver, her eyes gleaming with barely concealed arrogance as she watched them approach. Ah, Gunnar, she said, her voice smooth but laced with venom. The man who killed my father. And who's this? Her eyes flicked to Derren, assessing him with mild interest. Your new squire? Derren raised an eyebrow. Wow, first time meeting and you're already throwing shade. I'm impressed. Velara's lips curled into a smirk. You'll find I'm not one to waste time with pleasantries. Gunnar's expression remained impassive as he stood before her, but Derren could feel the tension radiating off him. Unlike with Nezra, the hostility here wasn't masked. It was on full display. Lissandra sent us, Gunnar said, his voice calm but direct. She's trying to keep this realm from falling apart. Velara's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. Oh, my dear sister, she purred. Always so noble, so concerned with doing what's right. She leaned forward, her eyes flashing with amusement. But you and I both know that right doesn't win wars, Gunnar. Power does. Gunnar's jaw tightened, but it was Derren who stepped forward. You know, for someone who claims to understand power, it's interesting how you're so focused on tearing down your own family. Seems like a waste of resources if you ask me. Velara's eyes snapped to Derren, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. And what would a mortal like you know of power? Derren shrugged, his tone casual. I know that when people start fighting over scraps, they miss the bigger picture. You want control? Sure. But if you tear everything apart in the process, what exactly are you ruling over? Velara's expression darkened, but she didn't immediately retort. Instead, she studied Derren, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of her throne. "You think I'm short-sighted?" "I think you're ambitious," Derren replied smoothly. "But ambition without direction tends to backfire. You want to rule this place, fine. But doing it by fighting your sisters and turning this realm into a battleground isn't going to get you what you want. You'll just end up ruling a pile of rubble." Velara's eyes narrowed, but Derren could see the gears turning in her mind. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like him. But instead of snapping back, she leaned back in her throne, her gaze flicking between Gunnar and Derren. "And what do you propose?" she asked, her voice quieter but no less dangerous. "That I simply bend the knee to Lissandra? Let her reign while I sit in the shadows?" Derren shook his head. "No, I'm saying you play smart. You and your sisters could be a united front, keeping this realm safe from whatever's still lurking in the shadows. Because, let's face it, your dad's magic didn't just vanish. You all know it's still out there, waiting." Velara's fingers stilled, her eyes narrowing. She didn't answer, but Derren could see the wheels turning. Gunnar remained silent, letting Derren handle the conversation, knowing his usual straightforward approach wouldn't work here. Finally, Velara stood, her gaze hard as she looked down at them. "I won't let Lissandra rule me, but I'll hear what you have to say, Gunnar. For now." Gunnar nodded. "Good, we'll take that as a step forward." As they turned to leave, Derren couldn't help but smirk, glancing over his shoulder at Velara. "By the way, I'd hold on to that ambition of yours. Just aim it at something that won't get you, and the realm, killed." Velara said nothing, her eyes gleaming with something Derren couldn't quite read. The halls of Ultranacious's castle loomed ahead, still bearing the scars of battles long past. The dark, towering structure was a reminder of their father's reign, a place that held as much fear as it did power. Lissandra had suggested they meet here for a reason. If they were to rebuild, they had to face the past. But getting her sisters to agree to come was no easy feat. Inside one of the side chambers, Gunnar and Derren stood, awaiting the arrival of Nezra and Velara. Lissandra paced the room, her expression tense. She wasn't convinced they would come. After everything that had happened, her sisters had no reason to trust her, no reason to even consider peace. "They'll come," Derren said confidently, leaning against the wall. He had been the one to convince them. Nezra and Velara had wanted nothing to do with this gathering, until Derren had made a promise of protection and, more importantly, a chance to see what Lissandra had accomplished since her father's fall. "I hope you're right," Lissandra murmured. "If they don't, this could all fall apart before it even starts." Gunnar remained silent, his gaze fixed on the doorway. If Nezra and Velara didn't show, the realm's fragile peace would be in jeopardy. But he trusted Derren's instincts. The man had a way with people that Gunnar never did. Sometimes charm and sarcasm worked where brute force couldn't. Moments later, the heavy doors creaked open, and Nezra entered, followed closely by Velara. Both sisters walked in with the same air of caution and distrust that had defined their previous meetings, but the fact that they had come at all was a victory in itself. "Impressive," Velara remarked as she looked around the room, her sharp gaze taking in the surroundings. "Our father's castle hasn't seen this much activity in years." Nezra remained silent, her eyes lingering on Lissandra with barely concealed suspicion. Lissandra straightened, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you both for coming. I know this isn't easy, but we need to talk about the future of the realm, about what we can achieve together." Nezra crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. "And why should we believe anything you say? You've had your chance to rule, and now you expect us to follow blindly?" Derren cleared his throat, stepping forward before the tension could escalate. "Hold up. No one's asking for blind loyalty. What Lissandra's offering is a chance to see for yourselves what she's done in such a short time. If nothing else, it's an opportunity to make sure this realm doesn't crumble under outside threats. And I think you'd both agree that's worth checking out." Velara raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the way Derren cut through the political nonsense. And if we find her efforts lacking, Derren grinned, then we're back to square one. But based on what I've seen, I think you'll be surprised. She's turned things around faster than anyone expected. There was a beat of silence before Nezra finally relented with a sigh. Fine. But this doesn't mean we trust her. We'll see what she's done. Lissandra nodded, visibly relieved. That's all I ask. The negotiations began in earnest, the sisters exchanging thinly veiled barbs as they discussed the future of the realm. But just when it seemed like progress was being made, Velara's voice dropped, her eyes gleaming with something dangerous. I know about the army, Velara said suddenly, her words slicing through the conversation like a blade. The room went still. What army? Lissandra asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Velara leaned back in her chair, her smile cold. There's a small force gathering in the northern mountains. They're planning to strike your lands, Lissandra. Apparently, not everyone is convinced you're fit to rule. Gunner's gaze sharpened, and even Derren felt the shift in the air. How do you know this? Lissandra demanded, her hands clenching into fists. Velara shrugged. I have my ways. Let's just say I'm not the only one who's been keeping tabs on things. I thought it best you know before they make their move. The revelation hung heavy in the air. What had begun as a tense negotiation had just become a race against time. If an army was gathering, then the realm was in more danger than any of them had realized. The tension in the room was palpable. After Velara's revelation about the army, the sisters exchanged uneasy glances, each weighing their options carefully. Gunner, standing with his arms crossed, broke the silence first. Will you fight? His voice was steady, eyes scanning each of the sisters in turn. Lissandra, without hesitation, stepped forward. Of course. I'll defend my people, whether you join me or not. Nezra and Velara, however, were more cautious. Nezra's arms remained crossed, her expression unreadable, while Velara's sharp eyes flicked between Gunner and her sisters. Why should we fight? Velara asked, her voice measured. The threat is against Lissandra, not us. Gunner's jaw tightened. And you think it'll stop there? He stepped forward, his cybernetic arm gleaming in the dim light. If this army defeats Lissandra, what's to stop them from turning on you next? Unless, of course, he added, his voice dropping with suspicion, one of you is behind it. The moment the words left his mouth, the air in the room grew colder. Velara's expression hardened, and Nezra's eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you accusing us of conspiracy? Nezra hissed. Derren, sensing the tension reaching a breaking point, quickly stepped in, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. Whoa, 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 let's all take a breath here. He glanced between the sisters, his tone light but serious. Nobody's accusing anyone of anything, except maybe being a little too eager to assume the worst. Velara's gaze softened slightly, but her stance remained defensive. He implied it. Derren flashed her a grin, stepping a little closer. Look, I get it. Gunner's not exactly the let's talk about our feelings kind of guy. But what he's saying makes sense. If this army takes out Lissandra, what's to stop them from marching on your lands next? Velara opened her mouth to retort, but Derren held up a finger, cutting her off. And even if they aren't targeting you now, it doesn't mean they won't. You both know how these things go. Power vacuums don't stay empty for long. It's in all of your best interests to stand together. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Derren's words sinking in. Velara and Nezra exchanged a glance, their earlier hostility giving way to consideration. I will personally lead the forces to defend the realm, Gunner said, breaking the silence. His tone was firm, unyielding. I've fought worse before. But before he could continue, Lissandra stepped forward, placing herself between Gunner and her sisters. No, she said quietly but firmly. This is not your fight, Gunner. It's ours. I'll lead the defense of my realm, whether my sisters join me or not. Gunner's brow furrowed, but he remained silent. Lissandra's resolve was clear, and he knew better than to challenge it. Nezra's gaze shifted between Lissandra and Velara, her expression unreadable. After a long moment, she finally spoke. "You're right," she said, her voice low but firm. "We can't afford to let this realm fall, not to an outside force. I'll stand with you." Velara hesitated, her sharp eyes locking onto Lissandra's. There was a flicker of something, pride perhaps, before she nodded. "We'll stand together," she said quietly. "We'll lead together." The sisters stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared decisions settling over them. For the first time in what felt like ages, they were united, not by love or trust, but by necessity. Derren let out a low whistle, glancing over at Gunnar. "Well, I'd say that went better than expected." Gunnar simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the sisters. "We've got a battle to prepare for." Gunnar took Derren aside, his expression serious as he readied Starbreaker. The weight of the upcoming battle hung heavy in the air, and Gunnar's mind was already racing through strategies. He looked Derren in the eye, sensing the tension. "Derren," Gunnar began, his voice low and steady, "this will be unlike any battle you've ever fought. You're walking into a war against creatures and forces that won't play by the rules. If you want to step back, no one would blame you." Derren raised an eyebrow, trying to mask the slight unease creeping up inside him with his usual sarcasm. "Step back? Please. And miss out on the fun? Not a chance." But beneath his quip, there was an understanding that Gunnar wasn't exaggerating. "I'm serious," Gunnar continued. "This is going to be brutal. I'm taking Alpha to scout the enemy's position, but I'm leaving you here. Your job is to keep the sisters from tearing each other apart while I'm gone. Maintain the peace between them, or we'll have an internal war before the real one even begins." Derren's expression shifted, more serious now as he nodded. He knew Gunnar wasn't just leaving him behind to play mediator. He was trusting him with one of the most volatile parts of the mission. "All right, I'll keep things from blowing up here, but you better come back in one piece." Gunnar gave a rare, faint smile. "I always do." As Gunnar finished preparing Starbreaker, Derren took a moment to inspect his shotgun. With a grin, he decided to give his weapon a proper name, tapping the engraved barrel. "Thunderstrike it is," he said to himself, taking comfort in the steady hum of the enchanted rounds locked and loaded. With Starbreaker ready and Alpha by his side, Gunnar glanced at Derren one last time. "Keep your wits about you, Derren. We'll need everything to hold together if we're going to win this." Yeah, Derren replied, his smirk returning as he hefted Thunderstrike over his shoulder. "You go play scout. I'll babysit the bickering queens." Gunnar nodded, turning toward the shadows where Alpha was waiting. With the weight of the realm on his shoulders, Gunnar disappeared into the night, ready to confront whatever forces lay ahead. Derren made his way back into the chamber where the sisters had gathered, each of them in their own corner, keeping distance from one another. Nezra sat with her arms crossed, her face as cold as ice, while Velara leaned casually against a pillar, inspecting her nails, clearly unbothered by the situation, or pretending to be. As he entered, they both turned their attention to him. "Where's Gunnar?" Velara asked, her voice edged with suspicion. "He didn't run off, did he?" Derren smiled, though there was a tightness to it. "Nah, he's gone to scout the enemy. Thought it might be a good idea to know what we're up against before we dive headfirst into battle." He let his words hang in the air for a moment before adding, "He took Alpha with him, so I'm sticking around to make sure things here don't fall apart." Nezra's eyes narrowed. "And what makes you think we need your help to keep things together?" "Nah," Derren shot her a wink, leaning against the back of a nearby chair. "Well, from what I've seen so far, let's just say it's better if someone's here to make sure the sisters don't start a civil war before the real fight begins." Velara snorted, though it was clear she wasn't entirely dismissive of his words. "And you think you can stop that?" "I've got a talent for smoothing things over," Derren replied, still calm, still trying to lighten the atmosphere. "Besides, Gunnar trusts me to keep you lot from killing each other." For a moment the room was silent, the sisters exchanging unreadable glances. Derren knew that the peace here was fragile, and Gunnar's absence was only making things tenser. He stepped forward, keeping his tone light but his words firm. "Look," he began, "I get it. Trust isn't exactly abundant around here, but whether you like it or not, you're all in this together now. So let's not waste time bickering while there's an army gathering to knock on our door. We can save the family feuds for later." Nezra's eyes flickered with something. Maybe annoyance, maybe grudging acceptance, while Velara raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying Derren's boldness. "And why should we listen to you?" Nezra asked, her voice cold as ever. "Because," Derren said, grinning in that infuriating way he had, "if you don't, you'll miss the chance to be the hero of this whole mess. And trust me, everyone loves a hero." Velara smirked. Nezra, however, simply exhaled sharply but didn't argue further. Derren took that as a small victory. Derren stood in the grand hall, waiting for some form of resistance or pushback from the sisters after he laid out the gravity of the situation. Instead, what he got was silence, an uncomfortable silence that lingered far too long. Velara shifted awkwardly, exchanging a glance with Nezra. Lissandra stared at the ground, her hand tracing the edge of the table, clearly uneasy. Finally, it was Nezra who broke the silence. "We've never led before," she admitted, her voice stiff as if the words themselves were bitter. Derren blinked, his brow furrowing. "Come again?" Nezra huffed, irritated. "We've never led a battle, all right. Not like what you're describing. Our father handled all of that. He gave the orders and we followed. We did what was expected of us. Nothing more." Derren stood stunned for a moment, then looked to Lissandra. "Is this true?" Lissandra nodded slowly, avoiding his gaze. "I've fought before, but I always fought alone. I've never commanded an army." Velara stepped forward, arms crossed defensively. "We command creatures, yes. But planning, strategy, that was never our role. We just did what our father told us to." Derren let out a long breath. "Well, that's great." Nezra frowned, clearly offended. "You think we're incompetent?" Derren quickly shook his head, raising his hands. "No, not incompetent. Just untrained. Look, commanding an army isn't just about raw power or how many griffins or wolves you have at your disposal. It's about coordination, timing, knowing when to strike and when to hold back." Velara scoffed. "And I suppose you're the expert on that?" Derren straightened, a flicker of confidence crossing his face. "Actually, yeah, I am. I've led men in battle. Real men. Not creatures or beasts, but soldiers. Gunnar and I served together in the army. I've seen battlefields torn apart because someone didn't know what they were doing." The sisters exchanged uneasy glances, their pride clearly at odds with the fact that they knew he was right. Derren pressed on. "You each have unique strengths. Velara, you command the air with your griffins and hawks. Nezra, you've got the beasts of the land under your control. And Lissandra, your stealth. You hit them where they don't expect it, slip in and out without a trace." Lissandra's lips curved into a small smile at his assessment, while Nezra and Velara seemed to listen more intently now. "Together you can dominate every aspect of the battlefield, air, ground, and shadows. But you need to work together. You need a plan. Otherwise, you'll be picked off one by one." Velara crossed her arms again, but this time there was less defensiveness in her tone. "So, what do you suggest?" Derren smirked, the confidence growing as he realized they were finally listening. "I'll help you put together a strategy. We've got a little time before the battle, so I'll give you a crash course in battlefield leadership. It's about more than just power. It's about knowing how to use it." Derren looked around the grand hall, noting the tensions still lingering between the sisters. He knew that if they were going to stand a chance against the approaching army, They had to be united, and that meant understanding how to fight together. He stood at the head of the table, clapping his hands to get their attention. "All right, ladies," Derren said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Gather around. We're going to run a little something we used to do in the military, a rock drill." Velara raised an eyebrow. "A what?" "A rock drill," Derren repeated, pulling out small objects, rocks, pieces of parchment, whatever he could find, to represent their forces. "We're going to map out the battle before we actually fight it. This way, you know where to put your air forces, your ground forces, and how Lissandra can move in with stealth. It's like a rehearsal, only with less blood." Lissandra leaned forward, intrigued, while Nezra crossed her arms but stayed silent, clearly willing to listen. Derren began arranging the objects on the table. "All right, so here's us. This is our defensive position." He placed a stone in the center of the table, symbolizing the castle and the immediate surrounding areas. "Now, here's the enemy." He positioned more rocks on the opposite side, spacing them out to represent the enemy's forces. "The idea is simple," Derren continued. "Velara, you'll be in charge of aerial strikes. Griffins, hawks, whatever you've got. They're fast and can hit the enemy from above while staying out of range." He placed a few small stones above the enemy rocks, motioning for Velara to follow along. "Nezra," Derren said, turning to her, "you've got the ground beasts. Wolves, bears, whatever's fast and deadly. They'll be flanking the enemy from both sides, cutting off any retreat and keeping pressure on them." He placed a few more stones to the left and right of the enemy forces. "And Lissandra," Derren said, finally addressing her, "you're going to do what you do best. You're stealth, right? Hit them where they least expect it. Find their weak points, their commanders, and take them out quietly before they know what's happening." He placed a small pebble near the back of the enemy's forces, symbolizing a stealth assault. Lissandra nodded, her eyes narrowing as she began to visualize her part in the plan. "Once we've thinned their ranks with aerial strikes and flanked them on the ground, Lissandra will clean up what's left. Then we close in, finish the job, and make sure none of them escape." Velara looked skeptical. "And what makes you think this'll work?" Derren grinned. "Because it's not just about power, it's about coordination. If we can hit them from multiple angles, keep them confused, they won't know what hit them. They'll be too busy reacting to you hitting them from the sky, the ground, and the shadows." Nezra stepped forward, studying the layout on the table. "You think we can actually pull this off?" Derren's eyes sparkled with confidence. "If you trust me and if you work together, you'll crush them." The sisters exchanged glances, uncertainty lingering for a moment before Lissandra spoke. "I'll follow this plan. We need to try something different if we're going to survive." Velara and Nezra nodded, slowly coming around to the idea. Derren clapped his hands together again, grinning. "All right then, let's get to work." The night had fallen, casting a blanket of darkness over the enemy encampment. Gunnar moved with practiced silence, his figure blending seamlessly into the shadows. Alpha, his dire wolf companion, prowled at his side, equally silent, his eyes glowing faintly as he watched for any sign of danger. The enemy force was larger than anticipated, spread out across the valley below, numbering at least 500 soldiers. They had brought a mix of heavy siege equipment, trebuchets and battering rams, and creatures unfamiliar to Gunnar, hulking beasts with thick armoured hides and riders that seemed to control them with a combination of magic and force. Gunnar crouched behind a large boulder at the edge of their camp, taking in the layout. Patrols moved in pairs, but the guards were lax, clearly not expecting anyone to come this deep into their territory. Gunnar signalled to Alpha, and the wolf slinked away, circling around to take out one of the sentries. With a flex of his wrist, the silver dagger hidden in his cybernetic arm extended, shimmering faintly in the moonlight. He crept toward another sentry, dispatching the man in one swift, silent motion. The blade pierced his neck cleanly, and Gunnar caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him without a sound. He moved methodically, eliminating a few more sentries with Alpha's help, creating gaps in their defense that would go unnoticed until it was too late. As he moved, Gunnar carefully studied their gear. Their armor was tough, likely reinforced with magic, and their siege equipment would be difficult to destroy head-on. But Gunnar didn't plan on attacking head-on. His mind worked quickly, analyzing their movements and the terrain. The enemy would likely advance along a narrow pass leading into the valley, a choke point that could be easily defended, but also exploited. If he could delay them long enough, he could give the sisters and Derren the time they needed to prepare. Gunnar began setting up booby traps along their predicted path, simple but effective. Tripwires connected to explosives, caltrops hidden under leaves and debris. He placed enchanted smoke bombs that would disorient and slow the enemy when they triggered them, creating chaos in their ranks. The traps wouldn't stop them, but they'd buy time. As he moved deeper into the camp, he spotted a large tent at the far end, heavily guarded. That's where the commanders will be, he thought. But taking them out now would be too risky. He needed to gather intel, not provoke a full-scale attack tonight. Alpha returned to his side, signaling that the area was clear. Gunnar patted the wolf's head, silently praising him. They had what they needed: the enemy's numbers, their siege equipment, and the weak points in their patrols. It was enough for now. Gunnar retreated back into the darkness, leaving the camp as quietly as he had entered, the traps set, and the path to victory slowly taking shape in his mind. As Gunnar made his way back through the dense undergrowth, something caught his eye. A narrow gorge with high, rocky walls on either side. It was the perfect natural choke point. The enemy would have no choice but to pass through here, and it would funnel their forces into a vulnerable position. He crouched down, scanning the area. The terrain was uneven and full of large boulders, perfect for setting traps and cover for an ambush. His mind worked quickly, calculating the potential for a surprise attack that would delay the advancing army. "I'll make my stand here," Gunnar murmured, glancing at Alpha. The dire wolf seemed to sense his thoughts, staying close as Gunnar marked positions for his traps. He'd place more explosives here, create hidden sniper perches, and set up a kill zone that would maximize damage while minimizing exposure. This would be the perfect place to turn the tide. Back at the castle, Derren walked with the sisters, inspecting the forces they had managed to gather. Velara's griffins circled in the sky, their sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Some were armoured, and their talons gleamed with steel, prepared for aerial combat. Below, Nezra's wolves and ground beasts were restless, pacing and growling. Some were massive, almost as large as horses, with thick fur and menacing fangs. Derren was impressed by their sheer size and ferocity. "You've got a solid force here," Derren said, looking at the creatures with a raised brow. "If we can get them to work together like we planned, you might actually pull this off." Velara walked beside him, her face hard but focused. "They're ready, but it's up to us to make sure they don't charge blindly." Derren nodded, gesturing toward Lissandra, who was in the distance, preparing her own stealth forces. "And Lissandra? She looks like she's got her part covered too." Nezra approached, her arms crossed. "She'll handle it. She's always been good at sneaking around." Derren smirked at the sibling rivalry but kept his focus on the task. "Well, you're all about to find out what it's like to fight as a unit, not just individuals. That's what'll make the difference between winning and losing." He surveyed the forces one more time, checking the equipment, the readiness of the beasts, and the determination in the sisters' eyes. Derren felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but if anyone could hold this group together, it was him. "All right," Derren said, hands on his hips. "Let's see if Gunnar finds anything that'll give us an edge." Gunnar's eyes stayed sharp, his muscles tense as the rumble of the approaching siege engines grew louder. He was preparing to fire the first shot when a slight rustle behind him gave away a flanking scout. Before Gunnar could react, Alpha was already in motion, a low growl preceding the brutal silence that followed. The scout never stood a chance, taken down swiftly by the dire wolf. But the scout wasn't alone. Gunnar whipped around, Starbreaker flashing in the dawn light as he dispatched 2 more scouts with precision shots. Their bodies crumpled before they could sound the alarm, but now Gunnar's cover was blown. He had no choice but to initiate the ambush early. "Time to move," he muttered. Taking careful aim, Gunnar fired the high-explosive 40mm round into the first siege engine. The explosion rocked the valley, sending debris flying as the engine was reduced to burning wreckage. Screams echoed as the chaos spread among the enemy ranks. He quickly reloaded and turned his sights on a giant troll leading a group of smaller creatures. The troll's thick armoured hide glinted in the firelight, but Starbreaker's enchanted rounds cut through it with ease. The troll fell with a roar, collapsing to the ground with a thud that shook the earth. At the castle, the warning. Derren stood atop the ramparts, checking the castle's defences one last time when the sound of distant explosions echoed across the valley. His heart sank. Gunnar's ambush had started earlier than planned. He rushed back to the courtyard where the sisters were waiting, his expression tense. "We've got to be ready." Sounds like Gunnar's already lit the fuse. Velara and Nezra exchanged nervous glances but nodded. The forces began to gather, sensing the approach of battle. Gunnar's pullback, meeting Lissandra. With the ambush in full swing, Gunnar knew it was time to break contact before the enemy regrouped. He signalled Alpha, and together they moved swiftly through the shadows, evading patrols as they made their way back to the castle. The traps he had laid slowed the enemy, but they wouldn't hold forever. As Gunnar neared the forest edge, a familiar figure emerged from the trees. Lissandra, cloaked in the mist of early morning, appeared with a small band of stealth fighters. "Gunnar," she said softly, her eyes scanning the battlefield behind him. "Good timing," he replied, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We've got to regroup. They're coming." Alpha padded to Lissandra's side, giving a low growl as he nudged her forward. Together, the 3 of them vanished into the cover of the trees, heading back toward the castle, ready to face the storm that was coming. Gunnar and Lissandra arrived back at the castle just as dawn fully broke. The air was thick with tension, and every eye was on them as they entered the war room. Derren stood with the sisters, their forces prepped and ready, but the worry was etched clearly on their faces. "We've got a problem," Gunnar said, his voice low but firm as he placed Starbreaker on the table. "They're more organised than we thought, and they've got siege equipment. I took out 1 engine and a giant troll leading a group, but there's more. A lot more." Lissandra stepped forward, adding, "Their numbers are high, and they've got beasts we didn't account for, but Gunnar's traps will slow them down." Derren crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. "How much time do we have?" Gunnar glanced at Alpha, who was still restless, pacing slightly as if sensing the impending danger. "Not long. They'll hit hard and fast once they clear the traps. We need to be ready to meet them head-on." Nezra stepped forward, her face hard with determination. "Then we fight." Velara, standing beside her sister, nodded. "The forces are ready. The question is, are we?" Gunnar took a deep breath, weighing the stakes. "We have no choice. We either hold this ground, or we lose everything." The battle plan. The forces gathered in the castle courtyard, each sister preparing their creatures for the fight ahead. The griffins circled in the air, their sharp eyes watching for any movement on the horizon, while the wolves and bears stood restless, waiting for the signal to charge. Derren stood on the battlements with the sisters, pointing to different sections of the valley below. "Velara, you'll hit them first from the air. We need to cripple their siege weapons as fast as possible." Velara nodded, already commanding her griffins to prepare for flight. "Nezra," Derren continued, "your beasts will flank them once they try to breach the gates. Use the trees for cover and hit them hard when they're most vulnerable." Nezra's eyes flickered with anticipation as she watched her wolves pacing, eager for battle. "Lissandra," Derren said, turning to her, You'll take your stealth team and hit the commanders. Without leadership, they'll fall into chaos. This has to be precise. Lissandra's gaze was cold and focused as she nodded, already preparing to slip into the shadows. Gunnar stepped up, his eyes scanning the horizon. I'll take the front line with the sisters. Starbreaker's rounds will take out whatever heavy forces they've got left. Alpha and I will hold them off as long as we can. Derren, his sarcasm momentarily absent, looked at Gunnar. Let's hope those traps did their job. The first clash. It wasn't long before the enemy appeared, cresting the hill in a black wave of armor, beasts, and siege machines. Gunnar's traps had slowed them, but not enough to cripple their advance. Velara's griffins launched into the air first, their wings casting shadows over the battlefield as they swooped down on the enemy's siege equipment. Their talons ripped through the wood and metal, tearing apart the machines, while the riders hurled enchanted spears at the crews below. The enemy responded quickly, firing arrows and magic into the sky, but Velara's forces were swift, darting between the attacks as they wreaked havoc on the siege engines. On the ground, Nezra's wolves and bears charged from the forest, crashing into the enemy's flanks. The ground shook with the impact as the beasts tore into the enemy lines, causing confusion and chaos among their ranks. Gunnar, with Starbreaker in hand, moved through the fray like a force of nature. He fired enchanted rounds into the advancing troops, each shot exploding with lethal precision. A group of heavily armored warriors charged him, but with a flick of his wrist, the silver dagger hidden in his arm extended, cutting through them effortlessly as he moved forward. Lissandra, meanwhile, was a ghost in the shadows. Her team slipped through the chaos, targeting the commanders hidden among the troops. With silent efficiency, they struck, each kill sending ripples of disorder through the enemy's forces. The enemy pushes back. Despite the initial success, the enemy rallied. More giant trolls lumbered into view, their massive clubs smashing through the trees and into Nezra's beasts. Dark magic crackled in the air as enemy mages unleashed spells that tore through the ranks of the defenders. Derren stood on the ramparts watching the battle unfold. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. "Where's Keebler when you need her?" Now Gunnar, still in the thick of the fight, saw the shift in momentum. "Derren!" he shouted over the chaos. "We need to hold them at the gate. We can't let them breach the walls." Derren nodded, his mind racing as he turned to the sisters. "Velara, pull your griffins back to the walls. We need air support to keep them from getting too close. Nezra, fall back and reinforce the gate." The sisters moved quickly, their forces adjusting to the new strategy as the enemy pressed forward. The battle was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The battle had descended into chaos. Dark magic crackled through the air, and the relentless assault of the enemy was threatening to overwhelm the defenders. Gunnar stood on the battlefield, Starbreaker in his grip, his muscles tense as he assessed the shifting tides of war. He could feel the weight of the moment, the enemy's sheer numbers, their brutal siege engines, and the oppressive darkness creeping closer. Beside him, Alpha prowled, his sleek form moving like a shadow across the bloodied ground. The dire wolf growled low, sensing the rising danger. Together, they were watching the enemy tighten its grip around the castle. This was the moment, the time to merge. Gunnar and Alpha shared a look, one filled with unspoken understanding, an acknowledgement of the primal bond that connected them. The air seemed to thicken, and a charge filled the space between them. As Gunnar inhaled, his senses began to shift, aligning with Alpha's predatory instincts. His heart raced in sync with Alpha's, their breaths becoming one. From the castle's walls, Derren and the sisters watched in silence, the strange energy that suddenly surrounded Gunnar making their skin tingle with anticipation. Derren had seen Gunnar do a lot of crazy things, but whatever this was, it was different. Darker. More primal. "What the hell's going on?" Derren muttered, his usual sarcasm momentarily replaced by genuine confusion. Before anyone could answer, the transformation began. Gunner's body tensed, and in an instant, the bond with Alpha flared to life. The merge was unlike anything else in battle. Gunner could feel the shift in his muscles, the surge of strength that wasn't purely his. His vision sharpened, colours becoming more vibrant, smells becoming more distinct as he gained Alpha's heightened senses. He became faster, more agile, his reflexes fine-tuned to a predatory edge. It wasn't just power, it was raw, animalistic synergy. Lissandra watched from the ramparts, her hands gripping the stone as memories flooded back. She had seen this once before, when Gunner had fought her father. The way he had moved, the power he had wielded, the way the tide had turned. Even now, after all those years, the sight of it sent a chill through her. This merge was a force of nature, unstoppable and terrifying. But Velara and Nezra, standing nearby, had never seen anything like it. Their eyes were wide, their breaths held as they watched Gunner's body ripple with enhanced strength. The air around him shimmered with the merging of energies, human and beast intertwined in perfect harmony. Alpha growled, his eyes glowing with the same predatory intensity as Gunner's. They moved together, in complete sync. And then, Gunner struck. With lightning speed, Gunner darted across the battlefield, Starbreaker firing in rapid succession. Each round exploded into the enemy ranks, sending bodies flying. His movements were impossibly fast, too quick for the enemy to track. A group of heavily armoured warriors rushed him, but they never stood a chance. Gunner dodged their attacks with animal-like agility, delivering killing blows with his hidden silver dagger, now extended from his cybernetic arm. A giant troll lumbered into view, its eyes burning with dark magic as it swung a massive club down toward Gunner. But in his merged state, Gunner was a blur. He slid beneath the troll, severing its Achilles tendon with a swipe of his dagger before flipping up and driving Starbreaker directly into its back. The enchanted bullets ripped through the troll's hide like paper, and the beast crumbled with a deafening roar. Derren, still watching from the walls, was in awe. Is he even human anymore? He whispered to himself, unable to comprehend the sheer ferocity of Gunner's attacks. I knew he was a badass, but this is insane. The sisters were equally stunned. Velara's griffins diving into the fight seemed almost slower compared to the fury of Gunner and Alpha's assault. Even Nezra's wolves, powerful in their own right, looked tame beside the raw power the merged duo unleashed. The enemy breaks. As Gunner and Alpha tore through the enemy lines, panic spread. The soldiers who had been marching forward with confidence now hesitated. The trolls fell back. The mage's spells sputtered in fear. They had never seen anything like this. An unstoppable force that seemed to predict their every move. A commander barked orders to regroup, but Gunner was already on him. He moved like a shadow, slipping through the lines and driving Starbreaker into the commander's chest. The magical impact sent a ripple of shockwaves through the ranks. The remaining siege engines rolled into position, but Gunner wasn't done. He loaded another high-explosive round into the 40mm launcher, aimed at the next engine, and fired. The explosion lit up the battlefield, sending burning fragments into the sky as the enemy's last hope for breaching the castle walls went up in flames. But it wasn't just the destruction that sent fear rippling through the enemy. It was Gunner and Alpha, standing side by side, an unstoppable force that defied the very magic they had been sent to crush. Back at the castle, awe and resolve. The enemy's retreat had begun, but the battle was not over. Lissandra stepped forward, her voice steady despite the shock of witnessing the merge again. Now's our chance to push them back. Derren, still in disbelief, finally regained his usual demeanour. I'm starting to understand why Keebler doesn't stand too close to him when he's angry. The sisters, inspired by Gunnar's display, rallied their forces with newfound vigour. Velara's griffins and Nezra's wolves surged forward with renewed purpose, tearing into the enemy with a ferocity that matched their leaders. As the enemy faltered, Lissandra prepared her forces to make one final push. With Gunnar and Alpha leading the charge, there was no doubt in her mind they could win this. With Gunnar and Alpha leading the charge, the enemy forces buckled under the sheer power of the merged duo. The once confident army now scrambled to retreat as Velara's griffins and Nezra's wolves tore through their ranks. The battlefield echoed with the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, and the roars of beasts fighting for survival. Derren, standing atop the battlements, yelled commands to the remaining forces. His voice, sharp and clear, carried over the chaos as the sisters' armies pressed their advantage. Lissandra moved with lethal precision through the shadows, her stealth fighters cutting down enemy mages and commanders before they had a chance to regroup. Gunnar, still merged with Alpha, was a blur of motion and destruction. The weight of the merge began to settle heavily on his shoulders, but he pushed through knowing the end was near. With every swing of Starbreaker, every snap of Alpha's jaws, the enemy was forced back, their morale shattered. The final wave of the enemy forces collapsed as Gunnar delivered a decisive blow, an explosive round that detonated among the retreating soldiers, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Tutufa, the cleanup. As the last of the enemy fled into the wilderness, the battlefield grew eerily quiet. Bodies and wreckage littered the ground, the remains of a hard-fought battle. The air still hummed with the aftermath of magic, and the sky, once filled with dark clouds, began to clear as if signalling the end of the conflict. Derren climbed down from the ramparts, exhausted but victorious. He surveyed the battlefield, taking in the carnage and the cost of the fight. Velara and Nezra gathered their remaining forces, tending to the wounded and ensuring no stragglers from the enemy lingered. Lissandra approached Gunnar, her eyes flicking from him to Alpha. "You did it," she said, her voice soft but full of admiration. "Again." But Gunnar, still merged with Alpha, said nothing. He was breathing heavily, his body trembling with the strain of maintaining the bond. The merge had given him the strength they needed to win, but now it was taking its toll. The exhaustion. As the adrenaline of the battle faded, Gunnar's strength began to wane. His legs felt heavy, and his vision blurred as the weight of Alpha's instincts and power pressed down on him. He staggered slightly, but Alpha was there, moving in tandem with him as they slowly separated from the merge. The process was always draining, but this time, it felt like it was pulling every ounce of energy from him. Alpha, too, was exhausted, his once bright eyes now dull with fatigue. Derren approached, noticing the change immediately. "Gunnar, you all right, man?" His voice was cautious, masking the concern he felt. Gunnar nodded but didn't speak. He pressed a hand to his temple, the pounding in his head growing more intense as the bond faded. His arm, still covered in sweat and grime, trembled slightly as he reached out to steady himself. Lissandra, seeing the toll the merge had taken, moved closer. "Come," she said softly. "We need to get you inside." Gunnar didn't argue. He let them lead him back toward the castle, Alpha limping beside him. Each step felt like a struggle, but as they passed through the castle gates, Gunnar knew one thing for sure. They had survived, and for now the realm was safe. With the battle finally over, the exhaustion from the merge weighed heavily on Gunnar. He slumped into a nearby chair in the great hall, struggling to stay upright. Derren and Lissandra moved quickly to his side, their expressions filled with concern. "Easy, man," Derren said softly, easing Gunnar into a more comfortable position. "You're not made of stone, even if you fight like it." Lissandra knelt beside them, her face soft with concern. "You've pushed yourself far enough today. Rest now." Across the hall, Velara and Nezra tended to Alpha, who was just as drained as Gunnar. The sisters worked quickly, offering water and food to the great dire wolf, their movements careful and respectful. Alpha's breathing was laboured, but his fierce eyes flickered with recognition as they cared for him. Gunnar, still fighting to stay conscious, looked up at Derren. "What about the forces?" Derren gave a tired smile. "Relax. They're not going anywhere tonight. You've done enough. It's time to let the rest of us pick up the slack for once." Lissandra nodded, her hand resting gently on Gunnar's shoulder. "We'll meet again in the morning. For now, the castle is safe, and our forces need to recover." Gunnar sighed, the weight of the battle finally pulling him down. He gave a slow nod. "All right. Tomorrow, we finish this." That night, Gunnar, Derren and Lissandra retire to rest, their bodies weary from the day's events. The sisters watch over their forces, ensuring that the beasts and creatures under their command are properly tended to. The promise of a final meeting looms in the air as everyone prepares for the decisive day to come. Gunnar's reflection. Lying in the stillness of the night, Gunnar's mind raced, despite his body's exhaustion. The merge with Alpha had taken more out of him than ever before. He stared up at the stone ceiling, replaying the battle over in his mind. The merge had been a necessity, but each time it felt like a deeper connection, pulling him closer to something primal. Could he continue to shoulder this burden? He thought of the pack and the promise he made to protect them, no matter the cost. Yet he also couldn't shake the image of Lissandra, standing so strong after the battle. She was no longer the frightened daughter of the demon king, but a leader in her own right. Her kingdom was healing, but now it was her leadership and the choices she made that would determine its future. Was this how his own path would end? Forever leading, always fighting. Derren's reflection. Derren leaned against the stone wall of his room, his eyes wide open as he stared into the darkness. A freaking merge, he whispered to himself. He had always known Gunnar was a badass, but what he had seen today was beyond anything he could have imagined. Gunnar and Alpha weren't just a man and his spirit animal. They were something far more powerful. The battle had shaken Derren, but it also woke something up in him. For years he had brushed off the supernatural, his skepticism keeping him grounded. But now? After witnessing today's fight, he wondered if his own role in all of this was about to change. Could he keep up in a world where legends fought with tooth and claw? But then, the memory of the sisters' vulnerability came back to him. He had seen their hesitation, their uncertainty in the fight. That's where his skills came in. He could lead them, guide them, give them the confidence to win. That was his edge. The one thing that magic couldn't take away from him. Lissandra's reflection. Lissandra sat by the fire in her chambers, the glow of the flames dancing over her armour. She traced a finger over the silver dagger that hung at her side, Gunnar's dagger. The weight of it had comforted her during the battle, but it also reminded her of the cost of leadership. Her father had ruled through fear and control, and now she was trying to build something better. But doubt crept into her mind. Would her sisters ever fully trust her? Could they truly rebuild after everything they had been through? And what of Gunnar? This man who had saved her not once but twice. She saw the toll the fight had taken on him, and she feared what lay ahead. The kingdom was starting to heal, yes, but there were shadows still lurking, and the betrayal she sensed from her own blood haunted her. She was a ruler now, but was she ready for the burdens that came with that title? Velara and Nezra's reflection. Velara and Nezra sat together in their chambers, the firelight flickering between them. Velara's griffins had been victorious today, but Nezra's wolves had suffered heavy losses. They could still hear the howling of the wounded in their minds. Were they truly ready to stand beside Lissandra in this fight? Their father had controlled them for so long, and now they had to find their own way. Velara looked at Nezra, her voice soft. Do we trust her? Nezra sighed, staring out the window at the recovering kingdom. We have to. It's not just about trust. It's about survival. The sun had barely risen and Gunnar was already up, stretching his stiff muscles. He groaned, rubbing his shoulder and casting a glance at Derren, who was still half asleep by the fire. I'm getting too old for this, Gunnar muttered, shaking his head. Derren opened one eye, smirking. Nah, you're just a little rusty. Maybe next time try merging with a chihuahua instead of a dire wolf. Gunnar chuckled, shaking his head. If you ever actually fought a battle, you might know how that feels. As they both rose to their feet, Alpha padded up, nudging Gunnar's leg affectionately. Derren pulled out a set of MREs from his pack, handing one to Gunnar and setting another down for Alpha. Breakfast of champions, Derren said sarcastically, tearing open the packet. Bon appétit. Hope you enjoy your cardboard-flavoured chili. Gunnar smirked, opening his own MRE. Can't be worse than the rations we had back in the day. Derren made a face, sniffing the MRE. Oh, I beg to differ. They've somehow perfected the art of making this taste worse. As they sat down, Velara and Nezra entered the hall, looking somewhat refreshed from the night. Derren, never missing a beat, held out one of the MREs toward them, his grin wide. Ladies, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, I present to you the finest culinary delight humanity has to offer. No magic required. Velara raised an eyebrow, inspecting the packet. What is it? Derren gave a mock bow. This, dear Velara, is an MRE, meals ready to excrete. Velara wrinkled her nose and Nezra couldn't help but smirk. It looks awful. Oh, it is, Derren said, taking a bite. Tastes like they mixed dirt and cardboard into a paste, dehydrated it then, threw in a bit of regret for flavour. Lissandra joined them, looking curious. And yet you eat it, Gunnar chuckled. It's a soldier's tradition. You hate it, but you eat it anyway. Alpha tore into his meal without complaint, causing Derren to glance at the wolf. At least someone appreciates the finer things. Takan. They sat around the table, sharing stories and laughing as Derren continued to poke fun at the MREs, even managing to get Velara and Nezra to try a bite. The two sisters gagged in unison after their first taste, causing everyone to burst into laughter. I think I'd rather fight the enemy again than eat this, Nezra said with a grin, wiping her mouth. Derren, sensing victory in the humour department, leaned back. See? I knew you'd understand. It was a rare moment of levity, the tension from the battle fading away as the group bonded over the shared experience. For just a little while, they weren't warriors preparing for another fight. They were comrades, brought together by the absurdity of military food and a shared sense of purpose. The fire crackled softly in the great hall as the sisters Velara, Nezra, and Lissandra sat across from Gunnar and Derren. The levity from their earlier meal faded as Derren leaned forward, his eyes flicking between the sisters. All right, he said, his tone shifting. Since we're all here, let's talk about the elephant in the room. A tense silence fell over the group. Velara, the eldest, glanced at Nezra, her expression unreadable. Lissandra, the youngest of the three, sat with her back straight, though her nervousness was clear in the way her hands fidgeted in her lap. And the elephant in the room wasn't just the threat of an army or the tenuous alliances forming, it was the deep-seated mistrust lingering between these three sisters. They may have fought together in battle, but the scars of their past, under the oppressive rule of their father, still ran deep. Derren leaned back, resting his elbows on the table, letting the silence grow heavy before breaking it. You three need to figure out how to work together, or all of this will fall apart the minute another threat shows up. No amount of armies or magic will protect this realm if its leaders are divided. Velara's stand. Velara, her silver hair catching the firelight, crossed her arms defensively. Her sharp eyes cut to Lissandra, who sat quietly at the end of the table. "You think this is about us being divided?" she scoffed. "The problem is that we were never united to begin with." She straightened in her seat, her voice growing cold. "Our father ruled with an iron fist. He controlled every move we made. We followed him because we had no choice. Now Lissandra expects us to fall in line behind her." Lissandra flinched slightly but kept her gaze steady, meeting her sister's eyes. "I don't want to be like him, Velara. I'm not trying to control you." Nezra, who had remained quiet thus far, finally spoke, her voice calm but full of tension. "We don't need another tyrant, Lissandra. We need to trust that you won't become one." Lissandra's struggle. Lissandra swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her sister's distrust. Velara and Nezra were strong, experienced in leading their own forces of griffins and wolves, respectively. Lissandra, though the youngest, had been forced to grow up quickly in the wake of her father's death. She had fought alone for years, using stealth and cunning to survive the darkness that had threatened to consume their realm. But now that the darkness was receding, she wanted more than survival. She wanted peace, unity. And she knew deep down that it couldn't happen without her sisters. "I know I've made mistakes," Lissandra said softly, her voice steady but full of emotion. "But I don't want to rule like Father did. I want us to work together, lead together." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment there was only the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth. Derren's intervention. Derren glanced at Gunnar, who remained silent, watching the tension unfold. Then, with his usual flair for timing, Derren leaned forward, breaking the silence. "You know," Derren began with a smirk, "I've been around a lot of siblings. Let me tell you, it's never easy. But the thing is, if you don't trust each other, the enemy's going to use that against you. I've seen it happen in the field more times than I can count." He turned to Velara. "You've got your griffins, right? Badass creatures, by the way. But what happens if Lissandra's forces don't have your back when the fight gets tough?" Then to Nezra. "Your wolves are fierce, but there's always a bigger beast out there. You think they'll hold the line without help?" Finally, he looked at Lissandra. "And you? You've been on your own for years, but this isn't the time to go solo anymore." The sisters exchanged wary glances but said nothing. Derren continued. "The point is, you three need to start acting like a team, not rivals, because if you don't, the next time an army shows up, it's game over." Gunnar speaks. Finally, Gunnar spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of his years of experience. "Derren's right. Trust isn't something you can demand, it's something you have to earn." He stood up, pacing slowly as he addressed the sisters. "I've led teams through wars, through battles that felt impossible to win. And every time it wasn't our strength or our weapons that won the fight. It was the trust we had in each other." His gaze landed on Lissandra. "You're not your father, Lissandra, but you have to show your sisters that. Words won't be enough. It's your actions that'll make them believe." The final agreement. Velara was the first to break the silence, her arms uncrossed, and she let out a slow breath. "All right," she said quietly, looking at Lissandra. "If you truly want us to lead together, then I'll stand with you. But this isn't blind loyalty. If I see you slipping into Father's ways, I'll stop you." Nezra nodded in agreement. "We stand together, or we fall together. No more divisions." Lissandra smiled faintly, the relief evident on her face. "Agreed." "Ah, Sansa," Derren's closing remark. Derren, sensing the tension dissolve, leaned back with a playful grin. "Well, that was almost too easy. I was expecting more drama. Maybe a few more explosions or someone to flip a table. Velara raised an eyebrow at him. You seem disappointed. Derren shrugged. What can I say? I live for the chaos. The sisters shared a small smile, the first real sign of unity among them. The battle had been hard fought, but the negotiations, as tense as they were, had forged something stronger. As they stood, the promise of rebuilding the realm, together, finally felt real. Chapter 21. Departure and Farewells. With the negotiations finally concluded, Gunnar stood, his imposing presence commanding the room. The sisters, now unified, looked to him for final words before their departure. You've done well, Gunnar said, his voice steady. This realm will heal, but if you ever need help, know that I'm just a call away. He reached into his pack, pulling out 3 intricately designed talismans, each glowing faintly with an ancient magic that Eli had infused with power. He handed one to Velara, Nezra, and finally to Lissandra. These will allow you to contact me directly, should the need arise. The sisters accepted the talismans with gratitude, recognizing the weight of the gesture. Velara clasped hers in her hand, nodding in understanding, while Nezra examined it with quiet respect. Lissandra smiled softly, a look of relief crossing her features as she tucked the talisman away. Gunnar then turned to Derren, who had been watching the exchange with a raised eyebrow. Derren, never one to miss an opportunity, smirked. So, where's mine? I feel left out of the whole fancy necklace club. Gunnar chuckled, shaking his head. You'd lose it in 5 minutes. Derren shrugged. Fair point. Eliana's portal. With a brief nod, Gunnar stepped away, contacting Eliana Vale through his own talisman. Within moments, a shimmering portal materialized before them, casting a soft light that contrasted with the war-torn hall. The sisters exchanged final farewells, each expressing their gratitude for Gunnar and Derren's help. There was an unspoken promise in their eyes, a newfound alliance, not just with each other, but with Gunnar as well. Lissandra lingered for a moment, her gaze meeting Gunnar's as the portal flickered. Thank you, Gunnar, she said quietly. For everything. Gunnar nodded. Lead them well. Back to Earth. As the portal shimmered around them, Alpha padded through first, followed by Gunnar and Derren. The transition was smooth, yet Derren couldn't help but glance back one last time at the realm they had helped unite. Stepping onto the familiar ground of their own world, Derren looked at Gunnar. So, no shiny necklace for me, but I get dragged to fight trolls and griffins. Fantastic. Gunnar gave a small, rare smile. You'll live.
All right, you've made it this far. That means either you like what you're seeing, or you're lost. Either way, no harm in sticking around, right? Go on, hit that subscribe button, join the team, and while you're at it, hit like, because, let's be honest, you're already invested. And the bell? That's for you if you don't want to miss any of the action. You wouldn't want me to come find you. See you soon, and remember, once you're in, you're family.